Right. Well, welcome everybody to the Ministry Forum's hosting of the virtual, the virtual book launch. We had an in-person book launch at Knox College about the end of September, but this is our kind of virtual book launch of Sarah Travis's book, Unsettling Worship, Reforming Liturgy for Right Relationships with Indigenous Communities. We're delighted to have Sarah with us. For those of you who don't know Sarah, but I'm thinking most of you probably do, she is the assistant professor of preaching, worship, and Christian ministry at Knox College. And in the new year, she'll have a new title, and we'll look forward to that. I am John Borthwick, and I am the director of the Center for Lifelong Learning at Knox College, a new initiative by the college. And Ministry Forum is our voice into the church and into the world. And we're delighted to host conversations just like this. Today's format will be fairly simple. I'll turn it over to Sarah to lead us through sort of the opening part, and then we'll have a conversation for a bit. We're looking to wrap up probably within an hour, probably wrap up. It could be sooner, could be later, depending on the breadth and depth of our conversations. If you've registered today and you are not with us, but you'll be watching this later, you're going to get the recording, which you're going to be able to see. We'll also create it as an audio, and there'll also be a transcript as well. We'll send it as a Dropbox folder, maybe today, tomorrow, or a couple days later, and you'll be able to see it then. Thank you so much for everyone joining us from across the country and even across the world. Today, we are delighted to have a guest from Sweden and guests from Western Canada, as well as Ontario. So, Sarah, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. This is so exciting. I want to begin by acknowledging the land. And this is an interesting exercise because we're all in different places. So I just want to say that I acknowledge that the land that I'm on, that I worship and work on, is the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Petun First Nations, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And with that acknowledgement, I commit to working toward reconciliation with those communities. And I would invite you to just think for a moment about the land that you're on and how it has been cared for and nurtured through the centuries. And we acknowledge all of those lands in this time. So I thought I would just begin by sharing a little bit about how this book came about. I've wanted to write about Indigenous settler relationships for a long time, and that urgency grew and grew, and eventually in about 2019, I decided to apply for a grant from the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship. And I received this grant to write about settler Indigenous relationships in terms of worship. And I honestly didn't know exactly where that was going to take me. And as I began my research and my reading, the discovery of the children's bodies happened in Kamloops and other places. And it really caused me to wonder, how on earth do we talk about these things in the pulpit and in worship? How do we have to say something. So how do we address those broken relationships in worship? And that started to evolve, that question. And I'll read a little bit from the book in a few minutes that will really target the kind of questions that I was asking. But the urgency has not diminished with time. It's gotten more and more urgent. And so this book is meant to be a contribution to a conversation. And I'm really hoping for some vigorous critique of what I've written, because I think it's that kind of book where it needs to be part of a much broader conversation. So I worked with a team of people, and Jermaine Lovelace is here, and he was one of those people. Brian Fraser and Laurie Ransom and Margaret Mullen were the other members of that group, and they really supported me and challenged me, and they all read the manuscript and commented on it, and we were even able post-pandemic to get together and share our thoughts and have wonderful conversations. And so I'm so grateful to that group, and they deserve credit in terms of the publication of this book. And it's been a wonderful experience. So Laurie Ransom read some words at the in-person book launch, and John is going to read those for us now, since Laurie was not able to be with us.
Happy to, Sarah. So these are Laurie's words and not mine, but I'll try to read them and maybe translate them if in case there's references to Laurie that obviously don't fit with me, but I'll do my best. Some opening remarks for Sarah's book launch by Laurie Ransom. I'm not only honored to have been asked to speak today, but also to have been asked by Sarah to journey with her and with other Indigenous and settler Presbyterians, as her idea for this book, Unsettling Worship, germinated and grew. Congratulations, Sarah. It's a beautiful and rich book. I read a draft about a year ago and returned to the draft in preparation for today and found myself thinking, did I read this material before? It's so fresh. I'm seeing new things and getting new insights. Wow, this is such a great book. My reaction tells me that other readers are likely to have a similar reaction and find that they will want to return to Sarah's work again and again as a resource for and meditation on worship. This is a deeply reflective book. Sarah examines each and every element of worship like a forensic scientist, carefully reflecting on why we do the things we do, how we do them, and perhaps most importantly, what attention must be paid to how members of the worshiping community in their diversity may respond to different aspects of worship because of their diversity, and why attention to decolonization is so important. For me, this is not only a book about decolonizing worship and decolonizing the theologies that are expressed through worship, but I also noted that in writing about the need to decolonize worship and theology, Sarah is in fact engaging in an act of repentance as a Christian leader. I say this reflecting on how, for many decades in this country, Indigenous ways of worshiping Creator were banned in Canadian law, not least because Christian leaders wanted it so. Indigenous peoples' ways of relating to Creator were under attack, and sadly, in some places, their ways of worship are still under attack. As Christians, I don't think we reflect deeply enough on the violent attacks suffered by Indigenous peoples for so very long on how they go about relating to their Creator God. This attack on how they relate to Creator is a deep facet of the historical trauma felt intergenerationally by the Indigenous community. And Sarah takes time in Unsettling Worship to unpack the meaning of that trauma. And of course, the trauma of residential institutions, which we reflect on this day, since Laurie was speaking on the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And the ongoing trauma for Indigenous communities as new information with respect to deaths and unmarked graves of Indigenous children continues to be uncovered. Even this week at Carcross in the Yukon, and last week by the Solo First Nation in British Columbia. Sarah also recognizes the very different but also significant intergenerational trauma experienced by settlers, which needs attending to. As settlers strive to reconcile what was done to Indigenous peoples with their own family, community, and nation stories and understanding of themselves. Sarah does so beautifully and lovingly. And as she has the courage to ask tough questions, such as what we do with those stories in Scripture that seem to portray God in God's self as perpetrator, one who is complicit in colonial activity, not to mention complicit in the genocide of peoples living in lands that Scripture tells us God promised to others. You'll have to read the book to find out how Sarah answers this very question. Sarah also reminds us of how Jesus was a colonial subject, how his family, the disciples, and the communities with whom they interacted were living under imperial Rome, and how we can use this knowledge in the process of decolonizing our approaches to worship. Her words reminded me of how the late Indigenous theologian Richard Twiss loved to speak of Jesus as a dark-haired, dark-eyed Indigenous boy. Readers will be eager to reflect on Sarah's advice concerning how to share the traumatic story of residential schools with the boys and girls, the young children of today, of all backgrounds, in a worship setting. Finally, Sarah tackles the challenge of worship leaders face of how they offer hope for the journey forward in the face of so many challenges which remain in our relationship. So I look forward to returning again and again to this beautifully written and deeply thoughtful book from someone who is so evidently equally passionate about the experience of worship within the Christian community and passionate and committed to the hard work of decolonizing our worship spaces and theologies to ensure the reflection of God's welcome and love for all peoples. Thank you, Sarah, so very much for sharing this gift with us. Lori Ransom.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Lori. I thought I would just read a little bit, and I hope that my internet is stable enough for you to be able to hear me. I'm going to read from the introduction that sort of situates the book so that those of you who haven't read it have some idea where it's coming from. Worship leaders and preachers have the ongoing challenge of addressing the realities of human life. War, natural disasters, disease, violence. We must speak into the void and into the chaos, into this grim fabric of life. We are invited to interpret the world through the lens of the gospel. The gospel consistently calls us toward truth-telling and reconciliation. Worship is a space in which to consider both the very worst that human beings are capable of and the very best. It is a space in which we are formed by the forgiveness of God in order to be made free to imagine better, stronger relationships. In Canada and other nations, the relationship of settler churches to Indigenous peoples is a significant area of concern. Seeking right relations is an urgent task because the damage has been immense. The lives of Indigenous folk literally depend on the manner in which settlers respond and repair the damage that has been done by generations of colonialism. Canada has undergone a process of truth and reconciliation similar to what occurred in South Africa after the end of apartheid. As a result, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada issued 94 calls to action, which offer a means for Canadians, including the parties of the settlement agreement, to respond to the TRC's findings. The settlement agreement represents the consensus reached between legal counsel for former residential school students, churches, the Assembly of First Nations, other Indigenous organizations, and the Government of Canada. Call to action number 59 reads, quote, "We call upon the church parties to the settlement agreement to develop ongoing education strategies to ensure that their respective congregations learn about their church's role in colonization, the history and legacy of residential schools, and why apologies to former residential school students, their families, and communities are necessary." End quote. Canadian churches have accepted a responsibility to teach about colonization and its implications, not only because they are parties to the settlement agreement, but also because reconciliation is an imperative for Christians. In worship, our identities as children of God are formed and expressed. Worship takes us on a journey as we gather, confess, hear the word and preach it, consider it, celebrate the sacraments, and are sent out into the world to live out what we have experienced within the context of worship. It is a space to consider our histories and varied identities, as well as our relationships with God and others. According to the final report of the TRC, quote, for churches, demonstrating long-term commitment requires atoning for actions within the residential schools, respecting Indigenous spirituality, and supporting Indigenous peoples' struggle for justice and equity, end quote. This book explores the question, how does worship prepare us to engage in the work of conciliation, reconciliation with Indigenous peoples? Using a framework of fourfold worship, I consider the ways that our worship gives space to examine and improve our relationships, not only with Indigenous peoples, but with all those we consider other. I begin with the assumption that worship is a formative practice for Christians. It shapes us in particular ways to be sent into the world as ambassadors of reconciliation. Christians often come to worship to feel better or more comfortable. The great challenge of decolonizing worship is that it will make us uncomfortable. Worship is designed to unsettle us. We should be disturbed by the word of God. Reconciliation is a word that should disturb us because it requires leaving behind comfortable spaces and entering into relationships that are fraught because of historical and contemporary colonialism and racism. None of this is easy. God's word and activity in worship are disruptive. They interrupt our systems and our plans. So that's where I'm coming from. And at this point, I want to open up the conversation. So some of you have read this book, and I'd love to receive your questions or your comments. And also a couple of questions for us to consider together. How can you imagine using this book in your worship context? And then the bigger question of what now? Having started on this journey, what happens next? What are the options for worshiping communities? So I'll open it up.
And I should do so. Folks are welcome to unmute themselves. If you'd rather just put something in the chat, we can also access it that way as well. So over to you all.
I just want to say thanks again to Sarah for pioneering this work, and I deliberately use that word pioneer because not only because of the context that I was born in, raised in, and also churched in, but also because of the fact that I have also come to a context where I have had you know, what I would call severe unease about the disconnect between worship and God's people, and how worship in a way had become the disconnector, that we worship because it makes us comfortable, and not that it draws us into that which worship is supposed to do. And as you read again your introduction, it sort of raised some goose pimples in my, on my own skin, because I believe that that should be the reason why we worship. That worship should not be the place where we come to, feel good. We feel good and go home. That is the perfect recipe for the death of the church, the death of worship life, and also the death of Christianity, any Christian life, comfortability. And I believe that what the book does, Reverend Sarah, is that it really draws us into doing some difficult things, stepping over some very difficult barriers that have been there for too long. And I mentioned the pioneering work that this book does. I've already introduced it to some members of the Moravian Church in the West Indies who are, explorers, and have been trying to explore for a long time just how to break the Europeanization of worship in our churches. I grew up in a Moravian church that all we sang were European songs. We prayed some prayers with language that we didn't even understand, and that's what we grew up in and grew up with. As a young pastor, I struggled with these liturgies and litanies, that had some very deep European language that people read but had no connection with, and I would have sat on several rewriting of hymnal committees, and to see the finished product that they came up with, it was the same thing. It was a regurgitation of the same kind of language. And I said to myself at one point, this just does not make sense. At some point or other, people are going to come to a place where they feel disconnected from God because we have nothing in our own language. We had a powerful language, or several powerful languages across the Caribbean. Not one piece of worship was written in our own language. And pastors like myself who would dare to speak the language, we were called rebels, we were called all sorts of names because of the fact that we thought that it was high time we worshipped in our own language, that we break away from the high, English that people did not even, some of the people who grew up in my church couldn't even read. And when I went to Northern Ontario, I met people in the on the reserves and also at the fellowship center there. They reminded me so much of people in my home church because they could not read the English language. They could not understand the English language. And how now do we get these brothers and sisters to worship so much so that worship is meaningful to them? So I thank you again for this work, and I will do my own bit. I have done some work already to introduce it to, people in a context in the Caribbean that I think they, and although it's not contextual to the Caribbean, it is addressing, and this is one of the great parts of the book, Sarah, that it's addressing worship in a way that I think wherever you go, whether in the West Indies or Europe or Africa, that it deals with worship in a way, in a very contextual way, that we'll be able to apply it wherever we are. So thank you again. And I feel very honored. I feel so honored to have been able to sit with you and also just to share my own humble thoughts, and that you have come up with this great piece of work from the sharing that we would have done in the way back in the summer last year. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jermaine. It was such an honor to journey with you, and I'm so excited to know that this has other applications, that it's relevant in other contexts. That's so good to know.
I haven't read the book yet, Sarah, so sorry about that. But
That's okay.
it's sitting there in my order list. I've started reading the ebook, and then I thought, okay, I've got to get the actual physical book here because I want it there in front of me. I'm just thinking about, and the answer might be just go finish the book, Matt. Go and finish reading it. But I'm wondering about this idea of like people being comfortable in worship. And I know like I've kind of thought about that a bunch over the last 20 years of ministry, and used to be pretty cynical, I think, about, well, are we just trying to make people feel okay? But especially in the last few years, part of me has said, yeah, I actually do want to help people feel okay once a week, because the other 6 days a week, they feel awful. I feel like there's a bit of a tricky balance there, of figuring that out. At the same time, I think this is really critical for us in Winnipeg. This is incredibly critical. And we've had conversations. We were doing land acknowledgements in our service in our church pretty early on, when that was first being talked about. And, it's just part of what is going on all the time in Winnipeg is figuring out this is a top of mind. It's a top of mind people. I think it's something like 1 in 5 people living in Winnipeg are Indigenous in some form in their ancestry. So that's a huge amount of the population. And so we've tried to figure out like how can we be in relationship. A lot of that has been done through like either Winnipeg Intercity Missions or Place of Hope Indigenous Presbyterian Church, where Reverend Margaret is minister there, or through the Kenora Fellowship Center. It's in our presbytery. So a lot of that has just been done like, can we help? Can we offer? Can we? And then how do we go beyond helping to how can we be in relationship? But I'm intrigued about how that actually shapes worship, because I haven't really, as the person who's responsible for that, I haven't really done much beyond like, we'll be praying for those communities, or we'll pray for, there's been a call to search landfills for the bodies of Indigenous women. And so praying for the pain of those families, and in some ways trying to also personalize this for people, and realize like this is this family that we know, or and not sort of this is some disconnected issue that's out there, but these are people that we're in relationship with. So I think we've been trying to do that, but I'm wondering about like how this shapes even liturgy, or whether it ought to impact my preaching more. I don't know. So I don't really know what I'm asking, but there you go.
Well, yeah, you said a lot of things that I can comment on. I think one of in Toronto, for example, I think this is an issue that kind of floats around, and people don't have relationships with Indigenous people. So it's a distant issue. And yet, I mean, my argument in the book is that, our church has committed to doing this work, and that it's part of what we need to do. So you're already better positioned, because you're more likely to be in relationship already with Indigenous people, or with the institutions that serve them. So that's a difference, I think, that I perceive, and others may disagree with me, but between Western Canada and this part of Canada. When it comes to how it works in liturgy, that there's that question of pastoral versus prophetic, and we all wrestle with that balance, and how to address that in a a way that we are speaking a word that challenges while also speaking a word that comforts. The prophets did that really, really well. They said some horrible things to people, but they still managed to pull it around to hope all the time. But the word that has been coming up more and more in my conversations about worship is safety. And that is, I think, a really urgent question for our time, is how do we challenge and disrupt and make uncomfortable while still creating spaces that are safe, or sufficiently safe, as Brian Fraser would say. And I've had some interesting conversations with people who perceive that worship is entirely safe, people who perceive that worship is entirely unsafe. And I fall somewhere in the middle. I think that we need to provide a certain level of safety to have these conversations. People will not be vulnerable if they're feeling unsafe. But that question of how to make the worship space sufficiently safe is a question that I don't actually answer in the book, because it's such a difficult question. In terms of the liturgy itself, I think one of the things that I'm highlighting that worship does is create a space for truth telling. And in our preaching, we do have this opportunity to tell the truth about what has happened in terms of settler colonial or settler Indigenous relationships. We have the opportunity to tell the truth in prayers. One of my greatest learnings was how important the prayer of confession is in worship, and the assurance of pardon. And I struggle with the assurance of pardon in the context of Indigenous settler relations, because we get up and we confess what we have done as a people in terms of our colonial history, which is just enormous and devastating. And then we are assured of our forgiveness. And what does it mean to be forgiven in an ongoing context of a disabled relationship? So it means something really good. It means that we are made free to begin again. So I think if nothing else, worship gives us that encouragement that we are made free, we are made ready to start these conversations.
Thanks,
I've been
Sarah.
sitting in the pew for the last 5 decades since I was ordained, except occasionally. So it's been kind of interesting as a preacher to be in that position. But one of the things I just wanted to interject at this point, and I think going to what you've been saying, Sarah, and what Matt was raising as a struggle, I think it's a matter of relationship. If we really work at building relationships, we can speak honestly and truthfully to those who are in our orbit, which for the congregational minister would be the congregation that they serve. I remember after about 2 years of building trust with a client, I finally told him what my diagnosis was, which was narcissistic personality. It threw him for a loop, and I wondered whether he'd come back the next week, but he did, and he had done a lot of processing, and it was actually initiated a radical transformation in his way of being in the world. And it was not just my relationship with him. This was a person who was raised in the church, who had been a leader in the church. And so there was a whole context in which I could speak the truth that I was experiencing in his way of relating to me, to his spouse, to his kids. So that's the one thing I just wanted to interject. The other thing is that one of the things that has had an influence on me when I am preparing a liturgy, because I always rewrite everything in the traditional liturgies, is my embracing both a feminist theology and queer theology.
Mhm.
These are lenses through which I see my own history and the church's history in very different ways than the traditional colonizing theology of our denomination.
Mm-hmm. Yes, those are incredibly helpful resources. And decolonizing is just another it's another lens to look at liturgy and look at the church and look at these relationships. Thank you.
I just wanted to offer a quote when you were talking about the tension, Sarah, at the beginning around between being comfortable in worship or being unsettled or uncomfortable. It reminded me of the quote by Annie Dillard, which I'm sure many people have heard, and I'm going to read it because I think it's hysterical. Annie Dillard says, "On the whole, I do not find Christians outside of the catacombs sufficiently sensible of conditions. Does anyone have the foggiest idea of what sort of power we so blithely invoke? Or, as I suspect, does no one believe a word of it? The churches are children playing on the floor with their chemistry sets, mixing up a batch of TNT to kill a Sunday morning. It's madness to wear ladies' straw hats and velvet hats to church. We should all be wearing crash helmets. Ushers should issue life preservers and signal flares. They should lash us to our pews, for the sleeping God may wake someday and take offense, or the waking God may draw us out to where we can never return." I think that speaks to both the comfort and discomfort, and as well as the safety or a safe space that worship might be.
It certainly does. I love that quote. And I think one of the realities that I want to highlight about this book is that it assumes that worship is powerful, that we are shaped by the language that we use, by the images that we hear. And as John Carr was speaking, it occurred to me that, I mean, ideally, we are in relationship with Indigenous people, directly in relationship. But when that doesn't happen or can't happen, I think that worship provides a space where we can be in at least a spiritual relationship with Indigenous people. And what that means is I think, you know, it's really great that we celebrate the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, or Indigenous Peoples Day, and we sometimes address those in worship, and that's really great and really important. But I think there needs to be an ongoing, regular presence in worship that addresses these issues and this broken relationship, so that it's not something we pray for once in a while. It's not something we celebrate occasionally in terms of we get excited when we do have a relationship with Indigenous people, and we want to celebrate that. But we need to do it on a much more regular basis, because so much in worship, we have this opportunity to encounter God in a way that we don't encounter God anywhere else. And we have an opportunity to encounter other people in this this strange sort of logic of worship that brings us into proximity with others.
I intend to purchase the book. Do you get into, so this may be a very simplistic question. Do you get into leading a congregation through how to change its worship or alter the worship practices to be more sensitive to the issues that you're raising? That's my first question. Then there's a follow-up.
Okay, so how do we get congregations to change the way they worship?
Yeah.
It's not something that I address directly,
Okay.
but it's an excellent question. I think we need to do more education about worship in general. And I also believe that I mean, for various practical reasons, worship has become the minister's job. And I really believe that sessions need to take more responsibility for understanding what worship is and how it functions, and then being part of that process of educating the congregation. So, it occurs to me that we don't. I went to a synagogue once for a Hanukkah service. And the thing that the rabbi did that was so amazing was, for every element of worship, he explained why we do this and what we are remembering. Because, of course, memory was such a big aspect of that service. But I think we need to do more of that. I think we need to explain to people, what is this assurance of pardon? What does this mean? And how important is it? So yeah, I think in general, we need to do more educating. And I will always say that worship is part of the ongoing conversation of the congregation. And so Indigenous realities need to be part of the ongoing conversation that a congregation is having. And then it's not a surprise when it appears in worship.
Okay. Yeah, I think you answered the second question, because as a retired minister, I'm although most of my experience as a retired minister doing pulpit supply, I do it from anywhere for a couple of weeks to 4 weeks. And I think you just answered the question. But before I begin, I think I would talk to the interim moderator about this, and then say, let's meet the session and talk about what we're doing in worship. And as you say, educate what we've done, and then move from there. Because I'm often inheriting an order of service that even I'm a little confused about. So
yes,
so it wouldn't hurt them to say, okay, and as a newcomer, go in and say, so why exactly are you doing this? And
right.
that would be a fun hour just there. then, okay, so thanks.
Mark Godden, did you want to get in? I saw you unmute a second ago. I'm not pressuring you, but just wondered.
Yeah, I did unmute briefly, but yeah, I just like a couple of questions. My context most recently has been quite different. I have been mostly preaching in outside of Canada. So, and I do talk about residential schools and the story of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. And I also do academic research on these things. But in terms of preaching and leading worship, the question that I have, I mean, something I've been thinking about is the gap between what we say our worship is and the history that we have.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think of growing up in Cambridge, Ontario, and the history that I was told about that area that I was taught at schools is entirely different than the real history. Has no, because I mean, one would hope it's different now, but there was very little about Indigenous people from the area. It was and the sense of Indigenous peoples being the past, a prehistory, not really there, even when Six Nations is just down the river. And so we have a liturgy that has grown up with a certain view of history. That does not, how do we acknowledge the untruth of our history? Do you talk about that? That's the first question. And I'm not sure which one's easier. The second question is there something that could be said in all of this about the difference between comfort on one hand and hope on the other? So that's
Wow.
say.
Yeah, I had the same experience as you did. We were probably in school at a similar time in Ontario, and we learned about the benign pioneers who came and settled the land. And then we did learn about the Indians and how they used every part of the bison. I remember learning about that. But we did not learn the real history. And I think that's true for many people who are sitting in our pews, is that they have not learned the real history. And therefore, I think worship leaders need to tell it, which will not make us popular. To name Indigenous people as whole people who have suffered and triumphed, who have lived in opposition to settlers in some ways, but have also found ways to cooperate and live peacefully together. So I think worship leaders need to tell the truth. And I mean, I've had people come up to me after those truth tellings and say things that are really difficult to hear. One minister told me that it was no different than what the residential schools were, no different than what English students going to boarding school had experienced. So people always interpret it in terms of their own experience. But I think hope is the antidote. There's some sense in which we tell the truth because we believe that telling the truth will repair and heal, which is not unlike what we do in all all aspects of worship. We tell the truth about human sinfulness, and we root that in the hope that we are forgiven and that there is a future that does not reflect the present. So I don't know if that's helpful, Mark, but
it's all good reflections. I mean, there is. I mean, there's no answer, is there? Or is there?
no, I don't think there's an answer. I think this is it's a hard time to be a preacher, and we're seeing this more and more in terms of what's happening in the world right now. How do you tell the truth when the truth is so convoluted? And that's part of the challenge of preaching about Indigenous realities, is that it's a complicated history. And I guess what I want to do is avoid a flat telling. So how do we bring these experiences and realities to life in our preaching, for example? How do we tell the stories of Indigenous people as whole people? Yeah.
Well, go ahead, Matt.
I was just gonna say, I feel like we're probably all preaching to the choir here. This is really important. This is what I wanted to say. I think our presbytery sent an overture to General Assembly last year, and I don't want to make it sound like Winnipeg is all sunshines and roses. It's not. Like, building relationships is always difficult, no matter who you're talking about. And so, and it's been a really, really long road within our presbytery, in the midst of massive decline in congregations, trying to figure out how do we continue in good relationship with our Indigenous communities, and then just feel like we're stumbling on that and not really doing well with those building relationships anyway. So anyway, what I wanted to say is there's very little money in Winnipeg in the Presbyterian Church, and there's massive need in Indigenous communities. Like, and if you look at, say, the nationally recognized Indigenous ministries in Canada for the PCC, they're all, Kenora is the farthest east, and it's all west of there. And, you know, other than maybe Hummingbird Ministries in Vancouver, most of those are in places where there's not a huge dollar base of support in those localities. And so it makes a big difference if there are churches, particularly in Ontario. There's a way bigger Presbyterian population. But if these issues are actually talked about in those places, it can actually make a real difference to the ministry that's being done amongst Indigenous communities and how those are supported, even financially. So all of our Indigenous ministries are hopelessly underfunded, which is tragic. We've said this as a top priority of our denomination, and there's still debates at General Assembly when there's, you know, when a little bit of extra money is asked for, you know, often that's gone through, but it's been in little bits, and it might look like a lot, like $1 million here or whatever, but it's really not. Like, these ministries need way more support than they have. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I just think probably I would think that within the context of worship, like this discussion and how that can make long-term impact in the lives of actual people, we might not see it. Like, you might not see it in a congregation, a little congregation in rural Ontario, where they're thinking this doesn't really connect for us. But as part of the wider denomination, like that can actually have real effect on the ground for people who are in great need, that our denomination has said, like, we've done wrong and we need to be walking alongside these folks. So anyway, I think this is a great conversation, because it's so important that this needs to be into the worship life of our congregations for it to ever have lasting change.
And I would say that it's so important that our worship relates to material well-being.
Yeah.
That worship is supposed to result in, well, as our Orthodox friends would say, the liturgy after the liturgy, where we actually go out into the world and live out what we have experienced. And, you know, I talk in this book about how we have made this commitment. Our denomination has made this commitment. And you're absolutely right that churches in Ontario and other places do have the freedom to contribute to these ministries in really significant ways. And in order to do that, they need to hear the stories.
This has been a rich conversation for sure. I wanted to just offer two little pieces into the mix. I think around worship, we often say words, and I think it's come to my mind much more also just by doing pulpit supply and stuff like that recently in my new role. When one introduces the offering, and then when one prays for the offering, we typically say words of like, this is going to have an impact beyond this space. And more I'm coming to a realization that I'm not being mean to churches and congregations, but more and more I'm aware of that's not necessarily true, in the sense that these offerings are really for us to sustain us. And I think worship was meant, the fourfold nature of worship was meant to encourage us to give of ourselves fully, not just for here, but beyond, as a part of worship. And I've loved what you said about that spiritual connection, that sort of transcendent connection through worship to other people, either whether it's our ancestors or whether it's people yet to come, or whether it's the tangible reality of people around the globe, for sure. The other thing I just would want to put out there around hope. I sometimes wonder around hope that for some that look like me, that tick boxes of privilege, hope isn't something that one has had to live with maybe as much as others. And I think the more we hear voices of people who are living in situations that are far different from the colonizers, the more we hear the ways in which people find hope in the midst of such challenging situations that one might look upon. We see that so often in the biblical text. And I think the more we listen to the voices of hope that exist out in the world, in other voices, in other realities, in other peoples, I think maybe that's how we'll begin to learn what hope actually looks like. Because I'm not sure 100% that that privileged white people often know what real hope looks like. It's a play on Paul's understanding of what real hope looks like. Yeah, fascinating. Sarah, any final comments as we wrap up?
I'm just reflecting on what you have said. I think privileged people often interpret scriptures of hope in an eschatological way, that someday there will be this new reality. And I think worship calls us into a space that recognizes that new reality is now, and that we need to pay attention to the material well-being of all people, that we need to pay attention to real bodies and the impacts that our words and our hope or lack of hope have on other people. So yeah, I'm just so grateful for this time of conversation, and I, as you read the book, I look forward to hearing your comments and your critiques, and especially how this is useful or not useful.
Thanks so much, Sarah. We'll wrap up the recording and let people offer their praise and thanks to you as a part of this conversation. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining in. If you haven't connected with the Ministry Forum community, please do so. You can be a part of future conversations like this, and we look forward to future conversations with Sarah along the way. We're grateful for her ministry and her witness within the church and certainly at Knox College. Thanks, everyone.